Part 9 of Oroonoko. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Oroonoko, or the Royal Slave, by Aphra Behn. Part 9. But as they could not march far that night, on Monday early, when the overseers went to call 'em all together to go to work, they were extremely surprised to find not one upon the place, but all fled with what baggage they had. You may imagine this news was not only suddenly spread all over the plantation, but soon reached the neighbouring ones, and we had by noon about 600 men, they called the militia of the country, that came to assist us in the pursuit of the fugitives. But never did one see so comical an army march forth to war. The men of any fashion would not concern themselves, though it were almost the common cause, for such revoltings are very ill examples, and have very fatal consequences oftentimes, in many colonies. But they had respect for Caesar, and all hands were against the Parhamites, as they called those of Parham plantation, because they did not in the first place love the Lord Governor, and secondly, they would have it that Caesar was ill used and baffled with, and 'tis not impossible but some of the best in the country was of his counsel in this flight, and depriving us of all the slaves, so that they of the better sort would not meddle in the matter. The deputy governor, of whom I have had no great occasion to speak, and who was the most fawning, fair-tongued fellow in the world, and one that pretended the most friendship to Caesar, was now the only violent man against him, and though he had nothing, and so need fear nothing, yet talked and looked bigger than any man. He was a fellow whose character is not fit to be mentioned with the worst of the slaves. This fellow would lead his army forth to meet Caesar, or rather to pursue him. Most of their arms were of the sort of cruel whips they call cat with 9 tails. Some had rusty, useless guns for show, others old basket hilts, whose blades had never seen the light in this age, and others had long staffs and clubs. Mr. Trefry went along, rather to be a mediator than a conqueror in such a battle, for he foresaw and knew, if by fighting they put the negroes into despair, they were a sort of sullen fellows, that would drown or kill themselves before they would yield, and he advised that fair means was best. But Byam was one that abounded in his own wit, and would take his own measures. It was not hard to find these fugitives, for as they fled they were forced to fire and cut the woods before 'em, so that night or day they pursued him by the light they made, and by the path they had cleared. But as soon as Caesar found he was pursued, he put himself in a posture of defence, placing all the women and children in the rear, and himself with Tuscan by his side or next to him, all promising to die or conquer. Encouraged thus, they never stood to parley, but fell on pell-mell upon the English, and killed some, and wounded a great many, they having recourse to their whips, as the best of their weapons. And as they observed no order, they perplexed the enemy so sorely, with lashing 'em in the eyes, and the women and children seeing their husbands so treated, being of fearful cowardly dispositions, and hearing the English cry out, "Yield and live! Yield and be pardoned!" they all run in amongst their husbands and fathers, and hung about them, crying out, "Yield, and leave Caesar to their revenge!" That by degrees the slaves abandoned Caesar, and left him only Tuscan and his heroic Amoinda, who, grown big as she was, did nevertheless press near her lord, having a bow and a quiver full of poisoned arrows, which she managed with such dexterity that she wounded several, and shot the governor into the shoulder, of which wound he had like to have died, but that an Indian woman, his mistress, sucked the wound and cleansed it from the venom. But however he stirred not from the place till he had parleyed with Caesar, who he found was resolved to die fighting, and would not be taken, no more would Tuscan or Amoinda. But he, more thirsting after revenge of another sort than that of depriving him of life, now made use of all his art of talking and dissembling, and besought Caesar to yield himself upon terms which he himself should propose, and should be scarcely assented to and kept by him. He told him it was not that he any longer feared him, or could believe the force of 2 men and a young heroine could overthrow all of them, and with all the slaves now on their side also, but it was the vast esteem he had for his person, the desire he had to serve so gallant a man, and to hinder himself from the reproach hereafter of having been the occasion of the death of a prince whose valour and magnanimity deserved the empire of the world. He protested to him, he looked upon this action as gallant and brave, however tending to the prejudice of his lord and master, who would by it have lost so considerable a number of slaves, that this flight of his should be looked on as a heat of youth, and a rashness of a too forward courage, and an unconsidered impatience of liberty, and no more, and no more, and that he laboured in vain to accomplish that which they would effectually perform as soon as any ship arrived that would touch on this coast. So that if you will be pleased, continued he, to surrender yourself, all imaginable respect shall be paid you, and yourself, your wife, and child, if it be born here, shall depart free of our land. But Caesar would hear of no composition, though Biam urged, if he pursued and went on in his design, he would inevitably perish, either by great snakes, wild beasts, or hunger, and he ought to have regard to his wife, whose condition required ease, and not the fatigues of tedious travel, where she could not be secured from being devoured. But Caesar told him there was no faith in the white men, or the gods they adored, who instructed them in principles so false that honest men could not live amongst them, that no people professed so much, none performed so little, that he knew what he had to do when he dealt with men of honour, but with them a man ought to be eternally on his guard, and never to eat and drink with Christians, without his weapon of defence in his hand, and for his own security never to credit one word they spoke. As for the rashness and inconsiderateness of his action, he would confess the governor is in the right, and that he was ashamed of what he had done, in endeavouring to make those free who were by nature slaves, poor wretched rogues, fit to be used as Christians' tolls, dogs, treacherous and cowardly, fit for such masters, and they wanted only but to be whipped into the knowledge of the Christian gods, to be the vilest of all creeping things, to learn to worship such deities as had not power to make them just, brave, or honest. In fine, after 1,000 things of this nature, not fit here to be recited, he told Biam he had rather die than live upon the same earth with such dogs. But Treffry and Biam pleaded and protested together so much that Treffry, believing the governor to mean what he said, and speaking very cordially himself, generously put himself into Caesar's hand, and took him aside, and persuaded him with tears to live by surrendering himself, and to name his conditions. Caesar was overcome by his wit and reasons, and in consideration of Amoinda, and demanding what he desired, and that it should be ratified by their hands in writing, because he had perceived that was the common way of contract between man and man among the whites. All this was performed, and Tuscan's pardon was put in, and they surrendered to the governor, who walked peaceably down into the plantation with them, after giving order to bury their dead. Caesar was very much toiled with the bustle of the day, for he had fought like a fury, and what mischief was done, he and Tuscan performed alone, and gave their enemies a fatal proof that they durst do anything, and feared no mortal force. But they were no sooner arrived at the place where all the slaves receive their punishments of whipping, but they laid hands on Caesar and Tuscan, faint with heat and toil, and surprising them, bound them to 2 several stakes, and whipped them in a most deplorable and inhuman manner, rending the very flesh from their bones, especially Caesar, who was not perceived to make any moan, or to alter his face, only to roll his eyes on the faithless governor, and those he believed guilty, with fierceness and indignation, and to complete his rage, he saw every one of those slaves, who but a few days before adored him as something more than mortal, now had a whip to give him some lashes, while he strove not to break his fetters, though if he had it were impossible, but he pronounced a woe and revenge from his eyes that darted fire, which was at once both awful and terrible to behold. When they thought they were sufficiently revenged on him, they untied him, almost fainting with loss of blood, from 1,000 wounds all over his body, from which they had rent his clothes, and led him bleeding and naked as he was, and loaded him all over with irons, and then rubbed his wounds, to complete their cruelty, with Indian pepper, which had like to have made him raving mad, and in this condition made him so fast to the ground that he could not stir, if his pains and wounds would have given him leave. They spared Amoinda, and did not let her see this barbarity committed towards her lord, but carried her down to Parham and shut her up, which was not in kindness to her, but for fear she should die with the sight, or miscarry, and they should then lose a young slave, and perhaps the mother. You must know that when the news was brought on Monday morning that Caesar had betaken himself to the woods, and carried with him all the negroes, we were possessed with extreme fear, which no persuasions could dissipate, that he would secure himself till night, and then that he would come down and cut all our throats. This apprehension made all the females of us fly down to the river to be secured, and while we were away they acted this cruelty; for I suppose I had authority and interest enough there, had I suspected any